Science is really awesome sauce, and with technology we can use it to explain our wonderfully weird world. So let's create our own weird world with some little creatures, a type of life simulation to explore evolution and natural selection, look at how DNA and mutations can be used to explain different traits, and experiment with different predator species and environmental conditions for our silly little friends. This is a gooblet, and now it's dead because it didn't get enough food and water. These are the only two things that gooblets need to survive, because they're very simple creatures and only have one brain cell. They're literally me. So whenever a gooblet's thirst stat gets below a certain level, it's going to start searching for a body of water to drink from. I programmed this so that it checks if there's already any water in its sight radius, and if not, it'll choose a random point and walk towards it. It'll keep doing this until it becomes so thirsty it dies, or it'll be able to find a water source and all will be well. Same thing goes for hunger. When it gets too hungry, it'll search for food that grows on these bushes and then waddle away to continue living its life. And that's our starting point. I ran 100 simulations of a single gooblet, and 99% of the time they were able to survive. The one that died was actually too busy wishlisting my upcoming game on Steam. Wink wink. So let's fill our world with a bunch more gooblets, because right now having only one gives it all the resources it ever needs, so we require some competition if we want to make this interesting. We know that water is infinite, so hundreds of gooblets can drink from the same source without running out. But food only grows back slowly once it's eaten, and each bush can only hold a maximum of 3 foods at a time, so let's see what happens when we dump 100 gooblets into the world with 2 bushes. Okay, so I massively overestimated how many gooblets could survive in this environment. There clearly wasn't enough food to go around, and so a lot of gooblets ended up dying at the beginning, as we can see from this massive downward spike when they all got hungry. But over time it begins to flatten out, and on average we get about 10 gooblets living in harmony together. Now since the gooblets can only live and die, the total population is going to decrease. So what if we gave them the ability to get funky? If a male and female gooblet are both well fed and well watered, they can decide to have a baby. I'm not quite sure how this works because, if we have red and blue parents, we can approximate that the gooblet offspring will be purple, with some variation either side, so it could be more like its mum or more like its dad. So this is the general concept of reproduction, or as we call it in Australia, mating. Adding this functionality into our simulation allows us to see that the population does decrease at first when our gooblets get hungry and all the food gets used up, but it rises slowly when the gooblets that do survive can mate and then fluctuates around a stable level, which in this case is about 20. In fancy biology language, we can call this number the carrying capacity, as it's the maximum number of gooblets that the environment can sustain. And as you might expect, if we simply add in some more bushes, we can keep a greater number of gooblets alive. It means there's more food to go around, so more gooblets can live together, which pushes our carrying capacity up to about 40-50ish. So it's not only determined by the creatures, but also the environment that they live in. I also found it interesting that if we start with 10 gooblets instead of 100, we still end up with the same carrying capacity. And I guess that's just because neither the gooblets nor the environment really changed. But this is still pretty simple. Each gooblet is practically identical, so I added some varying variables which can vary in its variability for speed, making each gooblet zoom faster to wherever they need to go, sight range so they can see things further away, and the number of children that they produce. And now when 2 gooblets have kids, their offspring will have stats that are an average of their mum and dad stats. So if one super fast and one super slow gooblet get funky together, their children will be pretty mid. And we're going to add or subtract some random value in these stats to account for genetic mutations. We'll look at this later in the video, but for now, this is just some random variation between gooblets. So now when we run the simulation, we can see how the average traits change over time, and even with the simple behaviours given to these creatures, we get quite complex results. We see that in this environment, it's better to have more children per generation, probably due to there not being any active threats to the gooblet race. Speed and sight both increase given enough time, which means we're getting more gooblets which are faster and better sighted. Now in hindsight, this is probably what we should have expected, because they can get to food and water quicker, allowing them to survive better and reproduce. And what we've just shown here is Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. over time the population will evolve with new traits to match the environment, and we continually approach the optimal gooblet. These gooblets have a better chance of surviving, and therefore reproducing, passing its traits onto its children and producing more optimal gooblets until something changes in the environment, which we will explore right now. Let's make two similar environments. They will have 2 ponds and 6 bushes each, except one is very small and condensed, and the other is a lot more spread out. So the only difference here is the size of the world. If we place 100 identical gooblets in each of these environments, we actually see a considerable difference in their evolution. In the small world, gooblets don't actually need to evolve better traits because even the weaker ones can survive. The resources are so close to them that it doesn't matter if they're slow or blind, because they'll still be able to reach them and reproduce. But when we spread out the ponds and bushes further, the weaker gooblets aren't able to track down food and water as easily, so it's a lot more important for gooblets to evolve quicker and stronger in this environment, because resources are just more difficult to find. So if they don't evolve quick enough, eventually the gooblet population will go extinct. And in a lot of simulations, this is what happened, and in some cases, a single gooblet hung on for a long time. But what they didn't realize is that they were alone, in an empty, simulated world. Their existence out of their control. Just like everyone on my Discord server. These are how speed and sight evolved in the smaller environment where it wasn't as crucial for gooblets to develop better traits. You can see that it does sort of increase, which makes sense, but when we compare it to the larger environment, you can clearly see the difference that this one change makes. The selective pressure of not having as much food and water led to faster and overall better evolution for these gooblets, especially for the sight range, which proved to be very important. And remember, we started with the exact same number and strength of gooblets in these simulations, and they just happened to evolve differently based on how spread out their food and water was. It's also interesting to note that for any simulation, we won't see many changes right at the beginning, because it still takes time to show if these evolutions are beneficial. And just for good measure, here are the graphs for the number of gooblets and number of children produced in both environments, and they do kind of have some interesting correlations, but nothing super important. Quick side tangent. For those interested in programming and game development, the gooblets essentially have a state machine where based on their hunger and thirst will either be looking for food, looking for water, looking for a mate, or if they've just gotten funky, they'll remain chill until they need to find more food and water again, and this is pretty much the way I coded this entire simulation. Another quick side tangent. You may be watching this video and saying, Icoso, you have all of these graphs and data, but you could just be making them up. Well, listen here, you clever little russet potato. This was my first real dive into data collection and analysis, so what I did was loop through each gooblet that was alive at any one time. Then I added their speed, sight, and number of kids to a running total to get the average. Then I wrote that data into an Excel spreadsheet, so every time this code runs it adds a new line into my file. And then I can import this newfangled data into After Effects, and with many hours of trying new things until it works, make an animated graph. You might not care about this as much as I do, and that's fine. I just thought it would be interesting to share, because I'm a silly little guy. What? Right now, speed and sight have 0 downsides. Obviously, if you can be faster and have better vision, you're going to survive better. So there has to be some sort of cost for having these better traits. It's like how taller people need to eat more food because they have more body to support. So I decided that a faster a gooblet is, the more hungry and thirsty it becomes, because it's going to be using more energy to move quicker. But the same logic doesn't really work for gooblets with better eyesight, because it doesn't take a whole lot of energy to just look for these resources. But in biology, sometimes changes to one trait can influence another in seemingly unpredictable and counterintuitive ways, sometimes called pleiotropy. And in the case of gooblets, having a better sight range is going to decrease the hunger and thirst thresholds. This is the point at which a gooblet realizes it's hungry or thirsty and begins searching for resources. So if you have a gooblet with a super large sight range or search radius, it's only going to search for food and water when it's really close to dying, and I hope this can lead to some more complex behaviors. But enough with the yapping, let's reboot our simulation and see what happens with these new changes. By adding punishments to the simulation, I thought we wouldn't see much of an increase in any of the traits because it simply wouldn't be as beneficial to the gooblet's survival. But this goes to show how evolution occurs. Even if I didn't think being fast was worth the negative effect, the simulation shows us that it is still important to develop this speed trait by some amount. But comparing it to the evolution without any punishments does show us that this change did have an influence, and gooblets stayed a bit slower to conserve energy. And this is how our sight range changed over time, which massively differs from without having any punishments. In fact, just by chance, the starting sight range seemed to be best fit for the gooblets who incurred the negative effect. Since it didn't increase or decrease, it just kinda stayed the same. As we didn't involve punishments for having more or less kids, this trait didn't change much either, but it's interesting to consider how the population numbers vary in the wave-like patterns over time as the new generations are born. I don't quite understand why we suddenly got this strange divergence halfway through, but I just want to take a second to appreciate how cool this is. Even with basic instructions, we get a series of interactions between organisms and the world that they live in. This is a very crude example of how plants and animals evolve in the real world. Now, I want to add a couple more changes into our simulation to make it a bit more realistic, because right now gooblets just give birth to fully grown gooblets. Instead, they should develop over time, and when it's just a silly little goobling, it's going to be quite vulnerable. Their speed and sight are going to start quite low, and only reach their maximum once they're fully matured. So now we have development time as another trait. Gooblets with a higher development stat will grow up faster. However, this also means that their hunger and thirst saturation bars will be slightly lower, meaning that they'll have to go searching for food and water more often to stay alive. Another thing to consider is that we're assuming all gooblets when they're born are at the same stage of development fresh out of the factory, so I want to rework this system a bit too. When a male and female gooblet get funky with one another, the female will give birth after, say, 10 to 20 seconds, and this can be thought of as its gestation period, or pregnancy. Females with a longer gestation period will produce its gooblings after a longer time, but the gooblings will be better developed since they've had a longer time cooking. So now we get this thing. Should you have more frequent and less developed offspring, or less frequent and more developed offspring? I don't know what's going to happen, and I guess we just have to start the simulation to find out. It appears that in this environment, gooblets really favour development time, meaning that they'll grow up faster but be slightly weaker when they're fully grown. Interestingly though, gestation period didn't seem to change that much, only decreasing slightly. So I suppose that this trait, alongside the number of kids, wasn't too influential in how the gooblets evolved. As normal, our speed and sight increased, except the speed was very smooth and linear, whereas the sight range is all over the place, and more jittery than me after downing 5 cups of coffee. And I'm really curious as to why this happens. I think it might be because when a gooblet is born, it inherits its parents' traits based on a percentage range. Because sight range is greater in the units used to measure it, there's greater variation in the values it can possibly take on when compared to move speed, which changes less so. What's also interesting is that since evolution produces stronger gooblets that can survive better, we actually see a decrease in our total population. The competition for food and water gets so intense that fewer gooblets can survive in the world. But it's also cool to see how chaotic the population seems to be at the beginning, but it still trends. We interrupt your scheduled programming with breaking news. We've just received intel of a cataclysmic event that has happened to us in the land of gooblets, conveniently separating them into 2 evenly numbered groups to see how they'll evolve differently. Both of these environments have the same resources and types of gooblets, but they're separated from one another and they can't cross over. So instead of traits, I'm interested in the colours that these gooblets converge to, because just by chance, the left side becomes more orange, whereas the right side becomes more blurple. And in a way, this kind of shows that we've created 2 different species, just by letting our simulation play out. Maybe this isn't species as such, because colour doesn't really have an impact on survival or reproduction, but perhaps something similar could happen for move speed and sight range. As you'd expect, our other traits remained pretty consistent between the 2 groups, apart from gestation period for some reason. Don't know why that happened, but throughout all of our experiments, have we empirically proven Charles Darwin's theory of speciation? Probably not, but it's still pretty cool. I think we've got a pretty awesome source simulation so far, so I want to take a detour into the wonderful world of genetics and biochemistry. Obvious disclaimer here because this stuff is complicated and you should take everything I'm about to say with a grain of some metallic and non-metallic elements ionically bonded. That wasn't funny, was it? I'm not going to include that in the video. Okay, so we've all heard of DNA, and we may just think of it as our genetics, and although that's kind of correct, we need to look at the central dogma of molecular biology, which sadly does not have anything to do with dogs, but it's still pretty cool. This says that we have genetic information stored in DNA, then it's copied into RNA and turned into proteins, which is what gives us our physical characteristics. For example, one section of DNA can encode for heightenase, and the more of this protein that our bodies produce, the taller we become. Another section of DNA can control eye color, another for brain size, essentially a me maker for different traits, all controlled by our genetics. When we get down to the molecular level, DNA contains 4 chemical components, A, T, C, and G. These are laid out next to each other in a string, and can take on essentially any combination. And these differences in DNA is what give people and gooblets different characteristics. It's similar to how sets of binary data in computers control different functions, and instead of 1s and 0s, we have these 4 letters, which we call bases. For example, let's take this specific group of A, T, C, and Gs. This is going to become the protein gooblinase, which makes gooblets red. So to make gooblinase, we need this little genetic robot called RNA polymerase, and what this does is read each of the letters in our DNA and copies them over one by one to a new molecule called RNA. And the only difference we care about here is that T is replaced with U, but everything else is the same. Asterisk. And we made copies of DNA because if our DNA becomes damaged or mutated in some weird way, we die, and I recently took an anatomy course at university and they said that dying is pretty bad for your health. Now another little machine comes along and turns this into a protein, although this process is a bit more complicated. First, we need to separate our A, U, C, and Gs into triplets, because this is how our machine interprets our data. Each of these 3 bases corresponds to a different protein subunit, which is essentially a collection of different elements which we call amino acids, but they're basically just Lego bricks, different pieces that when you put them together it creates a protein such as gooblinase. So our little machine first reads AUG, and it knows that this encodes for a methionine amino acid, so it goes and gets it and adds it to our chain. The next one is UGG and brings Hey, what are you doing? Don't click away. I promise we'll get back to the simulation stuff soon. Just give me a bit more time. We're almost done. So once all of the amino acids are in place, we have our gooblinase protein, which produces red in our gooblets, and this just goes back to our initial DNA sequence, resulting in physical traits. And if we change the DNA in some way, we'll make a different protein, say blueblinase, which makes our gooblets blue instead. Congratulations! You've just earned your PhD in molecular biology. But obviously, we're not tracking DNA sequences for each gooblet, because these components can be hundreds or thousands or even like tens of bases long, and that would just be impractical to code. So this is why we go back to using different probabilities to estimate what these genes are like, and then we can think about them in the form of biological and genetic information. So what we've seen so far is that at some point throughout each gooblet's unique DNA, we have a speed gene, which makes a speed protein, a sight gene and a sight protein, and attractiveness. It's time to alter our simulation to add a bit more complexity, because right now, as long as the male and female gooblets are hydrated and well fed, they want to boink real bad. But girls are only attracted to certain traits in gooblets and won't be down to get funky otherwise, as I've learnt from my countless rejections. I'm kidding, of course, I don't talk to girls, they're too scary. So we're going to give gooblets a new attractiveness trait, where male gooblets will have bigger antennae, and more attractive gooblets will have a better chance at mating when approaching a female. If they're successful, they can go and create some gooblings, resulting in more gooblets with larger antennae. However, this trait isn't going to be passed down like normal by mixing at birth to produce an average, sometimes referred to as continuous variation. For example, gooblets can take on any colour of the rainbow, and this is just how the colour gene happens to work. But some genes instead use discrete variation, and this would allow gooblets to be red, or green, or blue. The attractiveness gene that we're making is going to work like this, so in the land of gooblets, you're either hot or you're not. There's no in between. So let's say that this one base here could be T or A. If it's A, it's going to make the protein hoteinase as normal, which makes the gooblets really attractive. But if it's T, the hoteinase isn't made correctly, and so the gooblet will forever be schmugly. Now instead of having this entire sequence, we can write it as a lowercase h if the mystery base is T, and an uppercase H if it's A. oh my flip, it's the house logo. And without getting too complex, we essentially have two sets of almost identical DNA in our bodies, so we use two letters for each set. What we've done here is create a genotype, which is a way that we can explain the genetics of different gooblets. This means that if both our DNA sets are working optimally, we'll create lots and lots of hodinase and create a super attractive gooblet. But if neither is correct, our gooblets can't make hodinase, so it's unattractive. But what happens when we get something like this? Well, for some genes, they can either be dominant or submissive, dominant or recessive. In this case, our working DNA is considered dominant because if we have at least one of them, it makes hodinase and therefore attractive gooblets. So it doesn't matter if our genotype looks like this or like this, the gooblet will be at the same level of hotness when comparing against our other option which has no dominance, only recessiveness. So let's take a look at an example. If we have two gooblets, each with the genotype uppercase H, lowercase h, what is the genotype of the goobling that they produce? Well, since these two are the same, the gooblet will also be that, right? Yeah, no, kind of. I mean, like, you're half right. If we recognize that we have 4 total units of distinct DNA in the parents and only 2 in the child, we see that only one set of DNA from each parent is chosen to pass on to its child, and this is completely at random. So although we could get this genotype, we could also get both dominant or both recessive. We can summarize all this information in a Punnett square, which you might have seen before. We basically match up the genotypes of the parents, and then we can match up the probability of the child's DNA based off of that. In this instance, we see that there's a 2/4 chance for the goobling genotype to be the same as its parents, and since it still has an uppercase H, it'll be attractive. But there's also a 25% chance for a capital H arrangement, and a 25% chance the other way too for an entirely recessive gene and therefore an ugly gooblet. We know that this is all dependent on the parent's genes though, and there are actually 6 different combinations for all the different outcomes that our goobling can have. Half of them result in an 100% attractive gooblet. So let's add this to our simulation and see what effect this has. So when we run this, we can see how our genotypes change over time throughout our gooblet population. What I'm showing here is the proportion for only male gooblets, and we can see that the lowercase h goes down super quickly because it doesn't help in reproduction at all. And it actually makes it harder for these traits to be passed on because they have a higher chance of being rejected by female gooblets. So natural selection is going to essentially weed them out. Over time, the uppercase H, lowercase h falls, but it's never completely extinguished, and we actually see some tiny spikes back in the recessive gene when these two types of gooblets mate. But obviously the clear winner here is the entirely dominant attractive gene, because that's going to lead to more reproduction and passing on those genes to their children. But I'm really interested in this line here because it gets close to 0 but never reaches it. If we waited forever, there's certainly a chance that the recessive gene, lowercase h, could be eliminated entirely, but this would still take many, many generations to occur, and this isn't realistically achievable for our little simulation. Is what I thought before I ran a second experiment, and after a long time the lowercase h gene was gone. So unless some super complex science things happen, we would only get attractive gooblets from here on out. But this is only realistically possible due to a small population. In reference to animals and plants across the entire planet, this elimination of a recessive gene is highly unlikely. Now, someone please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that this project is pretty awesome sauce. So far we've looked at evolution, natural selection, DNA, and genetics, but I've mentioned mutations a few times. So what are they? Well, mutations are essentially changes in DNA. Okay, well there is more to it than that. Mutations happen all the time. Yellow capsicums and game dev YouTubers are great examples of this. We usually think of them as bad things, which sometimes they are, but they can also be completely harmless. Take this RNA sequence from before, which produces gooblinase and gives gooblets a red colour. If this base gets hit with cosmic rays and changes to a C, we instead get greenblinase, making gooblets orange. This is a mutation. We've changed a letter in our genetic information, which changes the protein we get, which changes our organism. This happens because our little protein machine comes in to build the protein, and remember that each set of 3 letters encodes for a unique amino acid. So because we've had a mutation changing G to C, the machine doesn't get a tryptophan like it normally should, but instead gets a serine acid, and this is why our protein ends up affecting our gooblets in different ways. And this sucks because tryptophan is canonically the best amino acid. I freaking love tryptophan. I guess you could say I'm a tryptophan. Haha, very funny. This is what we call a missense mutation, because we get a different amino acid and so we get a different protein. And just like before, if these mutated genes are in DNA, then they can carry on through generations, which is how we get genotypes in the first place. And this type of mutation could actually explain why our hydrogenase molecule from before didn't get created correctly. Now, this missense mutation that we've encountered changes the protein, but both proteins work just in different ways. What if the protein that we produce didn't get made at all? We started with our normal sequence and amino acids, but then we changed one base from a G to a C, which changed our protein, but if we changed it to an A, our machine doesn't have an amino acid for UAG, and it actually tells the machine to stop making the protein altogether. This is a nonsense mutation, which is a very silly name, and it doesn't produce gooblinase or greenblinase or blueblinase. We just don't get anything at all. So our gooblet doesn't develop any colour. I've snuck so much science in this video, you don't even realize how frickin' smart you're becoming. Going back to our binary metaphor from the start of the video, we can see that this set of 1s and 0s equals the letter L. But if we take this specific bit and flip it, our character is now a backslash, which is not an L. So if a compiler came along to try and run this mutated code, it's just not gonna work. But some mutations just aren't as detrimental. Say we get this sequence which encodes for an uppercase Y, and turning this 0 into a 1 changes our character to a lowercase y. So even if a compiler doesn't understand this, at least we can look at it and it still makes sense. So even if there's a really small chance for a gooblet to mutate from cosmic rays, this trait can be passed down to gooblets and start a whole new species, especially if that mutation happens to be helpful for survival. But that's another entire Darwinian conversation, not for this video. Before we return to our simulation and add some new species, it's time to dispel some science myths. DNA determines everything about you. This is false because, as we've seen in our simulations, changes in the environment can actually impact how you grow and live. And on a larger scale, also social influences, like how we can interact with other members of our species. Also, there's a variety of hazards out there. For example, pianos are not part of my DNA, but they can certainly affect me if they... Only the strongest creatures survive. Well, on the face of it, yes, but if we take someone super buff and strong, and, me, obviously the strong guy has a physical advantage, but if our environment contained only a few apples, the stronger guy needs more food to support his muscle, whereas I don't need as much food, and so I'm more likely to survive. Unless he beats me up. So survival of the strongest? No. But survival of the fittest? Yes. You can have as much muscle as you want, but if it's harmful for survival, then womp womp. An even better phrase might be survival of the fit enough, because gooblets can be less fit than others but still be healthy enough to live and pass on its genes. Evolution happens over millions of years. True, it does, but it also happens over less than millions of years, especially in our simulation where it takes about 10 minutes, even if it is a vast oversimplification of the process. Like we've said, gooblets are very basic and only have a few traits to evolve, so in this sense they're more like bacteria rather than animals, because generally the more complex an organism, the longer evolution takes. Evolution leads to immorality, and by that I mean creatures can become aggressive to prioritize their own survival over others. And although this makes sense intuitively, this is far from how humans have evolved over history. Being nice to others can actually help to protect you, so the social interactions we have can be especially powerful in evolutionary pathways. I highly recommend Primer's video on altruism, and as you could probably guess, I am a big fan, and my video here is kind of a homage to the entire channel, along with a bunch of others that I love. But going back to our main simulation, I hate how happy these gooblets are. They're surviving for generations and generations, and this is just unacceptable. So let's introduce a predator into the environment. This is a wombo, and it only needs one thing to survive: gooblets. And water. Everything that the gooblet gobblers do is just go around looking for gooblets to gobble, and if they don't eat enough of them, or if they end up eating all the gooblets, they'll die out as a species. And in a few simulations, this is what happened pretty early on. The wombos just went around and ate every gooblet, and since they didn't have any other source of food, they die from a vitamin G deficiency. But increasing the initial number of gooblets, there was actually enough of them that the wombos couldn't eat them all before they started to reproduce. So to make this a tiny bit more realistic, we're going to give the wombos the ability to reproduce as well, but in a slightly different way. Instead, once they reach a quota of 15 gooblets eaten, they'll summon another version of themselves. This is kinda representative of the real world since we do have sexual and asexual reproduction, but it's more like I've spent 700 million hours on this project already and I do have a life outside of this YouTube channel. It's called Stardew Valley, and I was really surprised that these two species could coexist for a reasonably long amount of time, but the wombos would eventually predominate. Since they're adding pressure on our gooblets to become stronger, they do keep reproducing and evolving, giving them better speed and side, but not enough to completely evade the wombos, they just ended up getting eaten. And our other traits from earlier are still in play here as well, and we can see that it's only better to have slightly less children, and there's not much correlation with development time or gestation period. I don't know, maybe I coded it wrong, or maybe these traits aren't actually that important to the gooblet survival. And just like how the different traits of gooblets can change when reproducing, the wombos also have a chance to mutate. They can become faster at the cost of becoming more hungry and have a larger search radius, which increases their quota of gooblets that they need to eat until reproducing. However, this doesn't really seem to have too much of an effect on our simulation. The graphs I'm showing here are an average from multiple tests, so we may just be reaching a natural stopping point where we have to completely revamp the system. I know that they look a bit like Doritos, and the bungers may be small in comparison to the massive wombos, but if 3 of them team up and climb on top of one, they can devour it. Now, because the wombos are so chunky, they don't get much from eating the bungers, so they'll just leave them alone. However, the gooblets will eat them if there's no other food around, but even then, the bungers are safe from the gooblets if they're on top of a wombo, so this leads to some interesting interactions, and we kind of have this rock, paper, scissors dynamic, where bungers eat wombos, wombos eat gooblets, and gooblets eat bungers, as well as normal food. And of course they all need water to survive. With that, we can see what happens when we put them all into the same environment, and it appears that the bungers dominate really quickly, and I initially thought that I had just accidentally programmed it so that they were unnecessarily powerful, but after some time the wombos died out from the oversaturation of bungers, and then the bungers didn't have any food sources, so the gooblet population slowly rose and became the only species left. And you know, this wasn't the most mind-blowing outcome or anything, but something I'd love to do in the future is add some more unique and complex behaviours to each of these species. For example, what if the wombos could communicate together and form herding strategies to corner gooblets in? Or what if bungers tended to travel in groups rather than randomly and by themselves? They'd probably have a better chance of taking down the wombos, but would be more susceptible to hungry gooblets. Anyway, here's the definition for scope creep. So what we've learnt from this simulation is that gooblets are and always will be the predominant species. Is what I thought. In smaller environments, gooblets are superior, but when bringing them to a larger scale, we actually see that the gooblets go extinct first, followed quickly by the wombos, and then a bit later the bungers. And it was super difficult to balance these guys so that they'd continue living in harmony together. So why does this happen? Let's go back to simply a gooblet like we had earlier in the video. The actual environment that they live in is quite static and doesn't change at all. Breaking news. It's raining. Yeah. So let's introduce a very basic weather system. It can either be sunny like it has been all this time, or it can start raining. If it's rainy, then the gooblet's sight range is going to get cut in half, but this also means that bushes are going to grow 50% faster. So with spending far too long on these particle effects, I let the gooblets live for a while in normal sunny weather, and as you'd expect, the population grew in size over time. But the gooblets actually started to thrive when it began to rain. Our carrying capacity almost doubled to 400 due to having more food, and we can see just how much our sight range is impacted when it's raining. But it still evolved like before, and even surpassed the original value when it was sunny. I suppose with more gooblets we can evolve our traits faster, but the rain also affected how much the gooblet population valued how quickly an individual grows up, which is the development time stat from before. I'm not quite sure why we got this change because the other life stats didn't change at all, so maybe something else is at play here, I don't know, I'm not a rainologist. Just for fun, if we increase the food growth rate from 50% to 500% when it's raining, we do see a difference in our number of gooblets, where we have a maximum of about 100 more. But it does seem to be a lot more unstable, which is kind of strange, and there literally isn't any difference in how sight range evolved, which I think makes sense because it's the bush's growth rate that's changing, not the actual gooblets themselves. Interestingly, we didn't get the change in development time like before with the upgraded food growth when it started raining, but they did end up at the same spot in the end, which is a bit weird, but she'll be right. I also experimented with different regions of temperature in the world to add a bit more complexity to the environment. The gooblets get more hungry and thirsty the further into the hotter area they go, but there's a higher food growth rate in this area, so it could possibly sustain more gooblets. In the cold region, they become a lot slower and have worse vision, but they'd be slightly less hungry. And this did lead to some interesting discoveries, because although gooblets technically don't have the skill to reason and rationalize and, think, the entire population tends to gravitate towards the center where they have a better chance of survival. In this very funky looking graph, we can see that the average distribution of gooblets over time generally stays near the center, but we started with an average X position in the middle, so to make sure there wasn't any silly business going on, I started the simulation again with all the gooblets in the hot region, and sure enough, they eventually migrated back into the center. And just to make sure this is right, we get a similar result if we start in the cold area as well. And so the middle ground was quite literally the middle ground for the best chance of living and reproducing. Look at me with my scientific rigor. Although the gooblets seem to prefer the hotter region just slightly more, so maybe the cold is tougher for gooblets before they begin to evolve their speed and sight. Or maybe the gooblets actually don't have any brain cells because they prefer summer weather for some hecking elusive reason. I am very glad it's winter over here in Australia. Okay, editor Icoso here. I wrote that line months ago when it was winter, but this project just grew so much and it took so long to edit that it is actually summer now and it is so hot. Someone please help me. These new temperature-based environments also made development time a critical trait for the gooblets, and this tracks pretty well given that newborn children don't survive very well in extreme conditions. Here's a comparison for development time with and without the different regions of temperature, and we can make sense of this as baby gooblings need to grow up quickly to develop their speed and sight if they want to have a good chance of survival. So development time inadvertently becomes pretty important. However, there was significantly less gooblets overall when we included temperature in our simulation, and I'm guessing this is just because both regions had negative effects which made it harder for gooblets to survive. And yeah, I don't know why this section of the graph is so wibbly wobbly, but I do know how much we love 2020. So another aspect I played around with was the spreading of disease. Basically, a gooblet will be infected with, say, tuberculosis, and every couple of seconds it'll sneeze, spreading particles in a nearby range. Then any other healthy gooblets who happen to be in this area have a chance of getting infected themselves, and I use this equation to increase the likelihood of getting sick the closer they are to the original sick gooblet. Then, after some time, they'll get better and remain immune, and I didn't spend too long working on this system, but it was cool to see this play out and have the disease spread over the world. We can see how this occurs in a graph too, which shows the funky looking dip at first before reaching a stable equilibrium where the percentage of infected gooblets didn't really move too much, and it did take a couple of attempts, but just by chance, the disease did go away by itself, leaving just healthy and immune gooblets behind, which was pretty interesting to see. It might be cool to look at different diseases that can jump between species, or contaminated food sources, or even genetic makeups which influence how the disease affects the gooblets. But above all, I would love to experiment with neural networks, especially as a neuroscience student, so maybe expect something like that from me way in the future. But for now, we've built a thriving, dynamic, and exciting ecosystem with 3 different species and a really interesting set of interactions. If I were to become a gooblet myself, I know that I would be a very happy, silly little guy. So that's the video. I don't really know how to end this, but I had tons of fun working on this project and I really hope you enjoyed it. I always appreciate y'all leaving comments and subscribing, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.